Yeah, welcome to my video blog, Questions of Doubt in Corporate Valuation. My name is Bernhard Schwetzler, and our today's question of doubt relates to the pricing of risky debt and its impact on corporate valuation. So the question is, junk bonds may have yields of well above 15%. Is it possible that in this special case, the cost of debt are even higher than the cost of equity of this firm? Yeah. So let's first have a look on these high yield bonds, or as they sometimes are referred to as junk bonds. Yeah. So here you see a copy and a graph of the bond price of defaultable and risky bonds. So you see here, for instance, this bond has a coupon rate of 3.75, and that means that based and related to its nominal and face value, it will pay an interest of 3.75% every year. And due to its high risk of default, the bond price has dropped, and thus the yield of the bond has increased to 10.25. Yeah? So you see here we have example of even 56% as the bond yield, or here 11.9 or 23%. So in that sense, these high yield bonds or these defaultable bonds have very high yields. And the question is then, is it possible, if we accept this to be the cost of debt, that the cost of debt of these firms are even higher than the cost of equity? That is what we are discussing today. So here again, a simple example highlighting the way how these bond yield is calculated. So you see here we have a bond with a coupon rate of 6% with a face value of 100, and that translates into these payments here. The bond has a bullet redemption. That means it is fully redeemed at once at the end of its lifetime. So that yields a coupon rate of 6% combined with a face value. These payments here of 6 and 106, including redemption. And now, due to the increase of the probability of default, the bond price has dropped by 30% from 100 to 70. And now the bond yield is calculated as being the internal rate of return combining this 70, the current bond price, with these promised payments. Yeah? And that combines to a bond yield as an IRR of almost 17%. Yeah? And the question is now, is it possible that these 17% are the cost of debt? And if so, is it even possible that these cost of debt exceed the cost of equity of this particular firm? Yeah? And the answer is no, this is not possible. Yeah? The cost of debt can never exceed the cost of equity, because debt is always strictly prioritized over equity. And that means that the debt holders get first all their payments, and their claim is then fully satisfied. And then if there is something left over, the equity holders get some money. Yeah? And that means that the risk of the debt holders must be lower than the risk of the equity holders. And as the cost of capital depend on the risk, the cost of debt must be lower than the ones of equity, because the risk of debt is lower. How does this fit together with our 17% bond yield? The answer is quite simple. These 17% is not the firm's cost of debt. Yeah? It is the promised yield, because it combines the promised payments with the current bond price. That is, this is the rate of return our bondholder gets if everything goes out fine. Yeah? But, and that's the reason why the bond price has been declining by 30%, there is a significant default probability, and that means that there is a probability that our bondholder will not get what is promised to him. Yeah? And so what we are interested in when we talk about cost of debt is actually the expected return or the expected yield of the bond. And that means that we have to take this potential default and the probability of default into account. Yeah? So in a very simplified example here, if we say that with 95% our investor gets what she has been promised, that is, she gets is 16.9%, but with a 5% probability our bond is going to default and there is no amount recovered. That means we lose the entire 100% of our investment, and in this simplified calculation, our real cost of debt as being the expected rate of return is simply here the average, the weighted average or the expected value over these two outcomes, and that translates into cost of debt of 10.25%. You still see that due to the credit risk and the default probability, there is a premium on top of the riskless rate, but you can also see that here the expected yield in this case is significantly lower than the promised one. So it would be a mistake if you would take the 16.9% as the firm's cost of debt. Yeah, whenever we talk about cost of debt, we talk about expected yields, and that is we have to take this default probability into account. So sometimes rating agencies publish so-called corporate yield spreads, and that these yield spread is always the difference between a corporate bond with a particular rating, here is the rating class, and with a particular time to maturity, over the riskless bonds. Usually these are government bonds. Yeah? So you see here in this case for a rating of AA minus with a 10-year time to maturity, the spread is 59 basis points. Be aware that these spreads here are calculated also usually based on promised yields. Yeah? That means that if we would go for high yield debt, for instance here BB plus and 10 years, we would have a spread of 210 basis points, then probably this would not be a good idea to calculate the cost of debt for a firm with this particular rating and this particular time to maturity to be 210 basis points above the riskless government rate, because, as I said, this is the promised yield spread, and of course the cost of debt relate to the expected yields or the expected rate of return spread. So just to wrap up, with respect to the cost of risk in defaultable debt, whenever we talk about cost of debt, we refer to expected rate of returns of debt, and that means that we have to include the possibility of default, whereas if we just look at bond yields, usually it is promised yields or promised rates of return that are calculated, and thus they do not serve as cost of debt. Yeah? And the difference between expected and promised may be negligible if a firm has an extremely high or extremely good rating, but if debt becomes risky, then of course these differences may become significant. Yeah? And that means that we would make a mistake for risky debt if we would take the promised yield as a cost of debt. So that's also true for the credit spreads that are sometimes published by a rating agency. They are mostly also relating to the spread between promised rates of returns and the riskless government bond. So finally, how do we get these expected rate of returns or the cost of defaultable debt? That's a bit difficult because usually we need to have an option pricing model to derive these cost of debt. But in one of the next QoD videos, I will try to do my best to come up with a simple version of such a model. And finally, just answering the question at the beginning of this video, the cost of debt can never exceed the cost of equity if the cost of debt are properly defined as the expected rate of return of debt. That's it. Thank you for today.